Okay, welcome to PalaccioMagazine.com. Our subject today is 1968 versus 2020. Is this time different? And I'm going to let these gentlemen introduce themselves. My name is Antonio Ruiz. Thomas, why don't you start off with, give us a 10-second.
Okay, 10-second. Madison Avenue, copyrighted 20 years. Public service in the city of Long Beach, probably another 12 years. And the last 4 or 5 years of my life been devoted to becoming a novelist.
Which I'm reading his novel right now.
Whoa, so you did finish the first volume?
That's correct. The first volume is precisely correct.
It's a 3-volume series, correct?
Yes, it's a 3-volume.
Okay. All 5,000 pages of it.
Yeah.
Dr. Carmichael Peters, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Carmichael Peters, currently I teach at Chapman University in philosophy and religious studies, and I direct the university honors program.
Fantastic. And of course, what am I? I'm publish a website called PalaccioMagazine.com, and I am a college student. So at Long Beach City College, went back to get my degree. So let's start off with the very first question. Where were you in 1968? So let's start with you, Doctor.
I was an undergraduate student at St. Ambrose College, now St. Ambrose University in Davenport, Iowa. I came to this country from Trinidad and Tobago in 1967. And in 1968, I was there, and I was in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, yelling with people as Mayor Daley's thugs beat on people. I wasn't beat upon. The world is watching. But that didn't stop them from doing whatever they wanted to do to us in Grant Park, which is ironic in that many years later, if we're going to talk about the contrast between then and now, it's where Obama held his victory gathering 12 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you involved in, besides Chicago, Democratic National Convention, were you involved in other street protests, or were you involved with other organizations active at that time?
I was also the president and founder of the Black Student Union at the university I attended. It was easy to be president. I think there were 5 of us, Black students.
Well, there you got it.
And I joined the anti-war movement. When I came to this country in '67, I didn't understand. I mean, I grew up in a colony, and so I knew about imperialism and colonialism,
right?
The weight of the crown of England. But when I came here, and I understood something, I didn't read extensively about neo-imperialism and the exploitation of capital as opposed to truths. But when I came here, I became aware. My majors were political science and history. I became aware of the United States Monroe Doctrine, which gave it the right to dominate the new world, quote unquote, and what was going on in Vietnam. So I joined the anti-war movement, and I joined, I didn't join the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, I opposed it. What I did join was what some people would call the Black Power movement, because of my agreement with Malcolm X, that the issue at the time was not the violation of the rights of citizens. And the civil rights movement, it seemed to me, focused upon the violation of the rights of citizens. When you deny people adequate employment, adequate house care, adequate medical care, when you denied them an education fitting for adequate employment in the world, when they are denied a material base so as to know something about material security, and when they are brutalized. In those days, the police forces in the Black communities were occupying forces. This isn't a violation of citizen rights, it's a violation of human rights. And so I thought Malcolm's call for taking this country to the World Court for violating the human rights of people of primarily African descent in this country was the right way to go. That was one of my objections, and eventually I ended up in the Black Panther Party. And the other part was that I thought the civil rights movement wasn't broad enough. I understand and understood the need to ask for a secure material base, but not sufficient attention was paid when civil rights leaders asked for their share of the wealth of this country. Not sufficient attention was paid whose lifeblood made up this pie.
Right.
And the people of Africa, Latin America, Asia, the exploitation of this country that I was sitting, as the reggae people like to say, in the belly of the beast. And this country, the crown, the new sort of empire, was sucking the wealth out of the world. And so to ask for our share of material security wasn't broad enough.
Yeah. Thomas, tell us a little bit about where you were in 1968.
Okay, and
besides the convention.
In January 1968, I won my freedom. I was emancipated from the United States Army. And I had served 2 years as a draftee. And it allowed me a couple of things. One, to be perfectly honest and perfectly blunt, it allowed me to get out of my house. And that was the main reason to get out of my household where I lived in Washington, D.C. It also broadened my horizon. It also radicalized me. Those were the byproducts of it. I served, never went to Vietnam. There was a reason why, which I won't get into, but I never went to Vietnam. And I served my time in Atlanta, Georgia, where I had exposure to H. Rap Brown and Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King was. And to be very honest with you, my political realizations more than anything was a individual thing. It was not an organized thing. I knew I had always opposed the Army when I was in Washington, D.C. before I was drafted, like a lot of kids were who were draft age. But unlike Carmichael, I was unclear about why. I just knew, my gut was, I knew it was wrong. I knew it was also wrong because the draft board in Washington, D.C. drafted exclusively from certain neighborhoods. And those certain neighborhoods they drafted from ended up being basically the shock troopers. They were combat troops in Vietnam. So again, this was all stuff that I knew in my gut. It took a while before it intellectually happened. Some people say it never happened intellectually. But when I got out of the Army in 1968, January 68, I felt emancipated. And one of the first things I did, I went to the area in Washington, D.C., which was called the Liberated Zone. And the Liberated Zone was actually DuPont Circle. Mm. And I got involved with radical politics there. I got on the alternative press, which was the Washington Free Press.
Yep, I remember reading it.
Yeah, I also, at the same time, got involved with an organization called the National Welfare Rights Organization.
Right.
And it was a group of women, mainly starting in the South, who protested about the fact that they wanted their rights as mothers. And they built this around welfare. And there was a Dr. George Wiley was the leader of that, leader in the sense that he got the funds together. He basically was the president. At any rate, when the Democratic Convention came around, I had two organizations that basically paid for me to go there. and it gave me an insight that to this day I think impacts me. I went there as a reporter for the Washington Free Press, which allowed me to be on the streets. And I also was able to be with the SDS leadership. I also, as I said, went with National Welfare Rights Organization. They were a lobbying group, lobbying at that time the Democratic Party, put in their platform about welfare rights. So I had credentials to go inside the convention. So I saw both how the sausage was made, and I saw how the sausage was ground on the streets.
Yeah.
And it was, for me, it was more than eye-opening. It really shook me to my core, because a lot of things I did later are outgrowth of that. I was actually had my own encounters with the Chicago police. And if you allow me, let me just tell you a quick story of what really sort of brought me around. One of the people that I knew quite well was a woman by the name of Kathy Wilkerson. Kathy Wilkerson's father owned the townhouse that was blown up by weathermen in
Manhattan.
Okay. I knew Kathy quite well. In fact, we lived in a commune together for a while. And that was, our involvement was basically that I lived there. I got to know her. I got to know a lot of the people in SDS. I never was an SDS member. But when I was there in Chicago, I hung out with them. That was a group that I hung out with at night. And one of the things I saw, which is probably my education about politics, was that the SDS leadership really, in a lot of ways, egged on. And what people don't sort of realize, there was not just a monolithic group that went to Chicago. There were the yippies, there were hippies, there were basically the Catholic priests and the lay people that went. There was also Black Panthers had representatives there. And the SDS, which later became Weathermen, their thing was because initially, the first peaceful. We were up in Lincoln Park, uptown. And the word was sort of given out, unofficially given out, was by the cops, was that basically, you guys stay up here. You do not go downtown to Grant Park. Stay up here. We will consider leaving you alone. And what happened was the SDS leadership was unhappy with that. They wanted to provoke a confrontation. And in fact, what they did was I know this because I was involved with the people that did it. They said, okay, we got to skip these yippies and these hippies downtown. So what they did, they went around saying a rumor that a yippie had gotten shot and killed by the police down in Grant Park. And we had to march down there. And that got a lot of people riled. They started going down. Now, they probably would have gone down anyway. I'm just saying, though, that was one of the impetus that got them down. That was the night, I believe it was the night, Thursday night, I believe, which is the night you were speaking about, Carmichael, when they said the whole world was watching. And they came down, and of course, the melee was on.
Right.
But what happened is I came out of that after being involved in internal aspects with the SDS, seeing what happened. I came out of that really, I think I probably had a mental breakdown, but that's not what I thought of it as that time. I came back and I realized that, this is not the way I want to see my life. And I'm glad I did that because, like I said earlier, Kathy Wilkerson and a couple others I know ended up in that townhouse. And I was living in Washington, D.C. I was living in New York City when that townhouse blew up. In fact, I was actually maybe about 6 blocks away when it happened. And that kind of shook me again. I got in advertising because at that point in time, it came down to, I need to make a living. I need to Christmas space. That's my story.
Yeah, let me just do this. Let's take a break. We come back. I'll kind of give my quickie bio for 1968. But what I wanted to then talk about is what were the themes that came out of 1968 that we're going to compare 2020 to. Yeah. So let's take a break, and we'll come back to segment 2 on ClosterMagazine.com. Welcome back to PalacioMagazine.com. My guests today are Thomas Fields and Dr. Carmichael Peters, and I'm Antonio Ruiz. So let me give my quick thing about me. The most succinct way of saying is 1968 was probably the most explosive year in my life. I was living in the Bronx. I started out actually 1968 working on Wall Street as a clerk. Middle part, I ended up working for a nonprofit that was focused on educational reform and was involved very much in the anti-teachers union strike that big part of 1968. That was my one arrest in my life. But then I ended the end of the year in a drug rehabilitation program as a heroin addict. So that was my 1968. But what was really crucial was, while these things were happening on a national level, there were these things on a street level, the local level. The teacher strike was, paralyzed New York City. And it was ironic that there were all these, it was literally the Black and Latino community against the overwhelmingly white, in many cases Jewish. I say that for a reason, teachers union, because of that, there was a lot of back and forth about anti-Semitism, about anti-Black. It really got ugly, to say the least. And there were a lot of riots as a result. So let's talk about 1968 and how do we contrast it with 2020. And I want to just go around real quick. If you had to come up with a description, a theme for 1968 and how you see it, what would be the one thing that stands out? I'll start with you, Doctor.
Military-industrial complex.
Thomas?
I say disorganization. It was disorganized.
Yes, because as I like to say, there was a lot of fire, a lot of heat, a lot of enthusiasm, but America still elected Richard Nixon. A lot of the issues that you're hearing today, police brutality, racism, you name it. So if you got 1968, and there was, not to say that there wasn't progress, how do you measure progress? But think about from 1968 to 2020, Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Clinton, and the omnibus crime bill, George W. Bush, and now we've got Donald Trump. So I'm just sort of wondering, for those who keep looking back in 1968 as like some kind of landmark year, why do you think people think that 1968 was a landmark year? Or do you think it was a landmark year?
I think there was a lot of hope that there was going to be radical change in this country. And it was intersectional. The women's movement, Black people, the organization of field workers, the Chicano movement. There was this, and young people who had seen through the bankruptcy of materialism. There was this constellation of events that it seemed so overwhelming that the system had to change. I'm not an optimist.
Well, I think you and I are the only
in other words,
non-optimists here.
I am not Thomas.
Thomas?
I'm not a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist.
Oh, okay.
I am a realist.
Realist.
What I have seen between then and now is the failure of...
I think your audio went down.
How is that?
And all of a sudden,
audio went down?
Yeah, all of a sudden I didn't hear you.
Oh.
Just speak a little louder.
Well, what I saw was between then and now, there has been no radical systemic change in this country.
Right.
But there has been progress.
Right.
And the progress has been the massive concentration of wealth, as has never before happened, to my knowledge, in this country. There has been a shift of wealth, and that is a remarkable change. There has also been, I don't think it can be denied, that there have been piecemeal changes, piecemeal, with radical reversals. And so today, if you were to talk about, initially you ask about themes from 68, themes now, we are fighting in many ways the same battle.
The same battles. Thomas?
Well, the one difference is 52 years.
Yeah, we are all great.
Half a century.
And we're all
Yeah, and we're all men. We're not running the streets. None of us. You know, it's true. I'm an optimist. I'll live up to that. Because there are things that I've seen that I thought I'd never see. I also wholeheartedly agree with Carmichael, Dr. Peters, that the changes have been by and large incidental. They certainly have not been systematic, because we are looking at systematic racism, institutional racism. That takes a whole nother thing. And I guess what does give me hope for the future is demographics. To me, demographics are the future. You can tell where you're going by looking at demographics. And one of the things that happened in the 60s, why I think the 60s came about, the late 60s came about to be the way they were, is because of demographics. And those demographics were those kids who were the children of soldiers coming back from the war, had this bubble. And it was this thing that happened, and from a marketing standpoint, it was you basically marketed to that bubble. That bubble was marketed to, that bubble came, and their parents thought they were great. These wonderful children. I mean, it was like never before. And those wonderful children took in their heads that, hey, we are destined for greatness. We're destined for wonderful things. We're destined to how we feel like. And that, in point of fact, I think, was the mindset that got a lot of kids out in the streets, that they believed that they were destined to change. Well, the reality was the state came down, and the state came down very hard and made it very clear there was a backlash. And that backlash, as you say, stated before, is in the form of Richard Nixon and the silent majority. The difference, I think, now is, again, demographics. The demographics in this country has been that it's going from a white country, predominantly white country, and white means a lot of things. We won't get into that discussion, but white means a lot of things, to what will be seen as a majority country of color. And there is a backlash, which we're seeing, but there also means that change is taking place of people who are throwing in their future with people that they would probably not have thrown in before. And I think that makes a difference. Now, how much of a difference it'll make? Will it make those systemic changes? I think it might, but I'm not good. To me, it's the story is still to be written.
Let's take our second break. When we come back, let's talk about those 52 years, where we've landed in 2020, because there's a lot of things that happened in those 22 years, 2 years, that really brought us first to 2016. Well, let's even go back even more. I mean, we can talk about 2008, 2016, 2018, and now in 2020, because I like to think that we arrived in 2016 because we elected a black president in 2008. But I really want to focus a lot more on where we are here today. So let's take our break, come back, and we'll talk some more. Welcome back to PalacioMagazine.com. My guests are Thomas Fields and Dr. Carmichael Peters. So there's so much that we can talk about the last 52 years, but I want to focus on 2020. And what does this time look like? So I put a list together that I sent you guys. And obviously, the biggest thing to me is how, well, we have the internet, we have social media, we have 500 media channels, we have, you name it, in terms of chat rooms and different ways that people can isolate themselves and speak to each other. You have cell phone video, which people use pretty regularly. You have a pandemic, although some people don't believe there is such a thing. You have Donald Trump and the right-wing GOP. That was an outgrowth of the Tea Party formation back in 2008.
I prefer to refer to them by their original name, teabaggers.
Teabaggers, yes, that's an even better word. You have obviously right-wing media. You have a very fractured Democratic Party, or some of us might call a weak political party. You have race and class, meaning non-Black American populations like Latinx, Asian, who sometimes are how do I say this in a nice way, are racist in their own right.
I mean, colorists.
Colorists. Well, okay. And some of them being Trumpsters. So that's my list. What would you add to that list that makes 2020 different than 1968?
If I could, two things. One, 1968, there were changes, but what we saw was the incredible capacity of this society to co-opt anything. So when they began selling Mao caps on Fifth Avenue, you knew something had changed. When Malcolm X ended up on a stamp, you knew something had changed. When they made MLK holiday not the day of his murder, but his birthday, and then it whitewashed MLK's memory. And so that's one thing, co-option. And therefore, I don't think that what is going on now will not be co-opted again. Cell phones. One of the things I think that is slightly different, and in a peculiar way, as a quick side, for decades, campesinos in Honduras, in El Salvador, were talking about the massacre that they were subjected to, often by religious evangelical governments. But no one paid attention to them until the United Nations did a Truth Commission. And when the Truth Commission came out with its findings, it was the lead story on the three major networks at the time. That was wonderful. But what it did, it was that it reinscribed the silencing of the poor. They could not be trusted. You can't take their word for it. But when the talking heads of power spoke, then suddenly we pay attention to them. That's dangerous. Cell phones, connection. Black folks have been talking about police brutality, since we were born.
Yeah.
But we couldn't be trusted. But when people took these little machines and began recording, the evidence was incontrovertible, and even then they tried to deny it. Because of these machines, we saw the murder in slow motion of somebody, a casual murder. The dude who killed him had his hand in his pocket. Casual. And so this is a major difference. But it's also, with our 800 channels, there is a problem. And the problem is, one of the essentials, no democracy is perfect.
Right.
But and the approach to democracy is always asymptotic. We kind of approach, and we all, make more perfect union. Cool. But essential to a democracy is the ability to carry on civil conversations across lines of genuine difference. We are losing that ability because of our 1,000 channels and because of this media thing. We now speak in silence. We don't know.
Is there an airplane?
Yes, it's military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
So,
can I just jump in here for a second? Because one of the things that's so I keep hearing over the last few years is that we don't even have common facts, common truths that we can agree on. And if we can't even do that, Donald Trump has made sure of that, and Fox News has made sure of that how can we have that conversation, because we can't even agree on the basis on what is truth.
But I think, forgive me for talking too much, but I think facts are not controvertible. And we have to distinguish between what can be controverted and what cannot be controverted. We don't have a variety of facts. What we have is a variety of interpretation of the facts. We can fight each other about the interpretation, but when we make the facts themselves controvertible, we lose one of the essential things for reasonable conversation, and that is publicly verifiable facts is the basis of conversation. And upon that, we engage in reasoned argument, and then we end up with sound conclusions. But if the facts are controvertible, if there are alternative facts, we can't start a conversation, and we should never agree to pretend that we can have a conversation with alternative facts.
Thomas, what do you?
Well,
2020.
A couple things. I actually happen to think that Donald Trump was a great catalyst for this country. Prior to Donald Trump, politicians with his belief system practiced the dog whistle. They used those words that, people knew what they were talking about, but it signaled to their followers, their supporters, their disdain for civil rights, their disdain for human rights, their disdain for blacks and other people of color. And they got it. And that was pretty much the bedrock of the Southern strategy. What Donald Trump did was bring it all in the open with a bullhorn. And what I think is the outgrowth of what you're seeing now is that it's very clear now. Donald Trump has made it acceptable for people that hold those beliefs to come in front of a camera when someone is recording them to make those, to say those things. And what it does is crystallizes things. You no longer, in many cases, you no longer have to say, I think this person is racist, or those comments might be racist. People are coming out and making those statements. That is galvanized. I think that, along with, as you mentioned, the cell phones video of people being brutalized by police. Now, the other part about that is this. This just sort of follows a continuum. In the 60s, what galvanized people to go to the South and what galvanized civil rights was when you saw Bull Connor on television, and that was black and white, and that was only 3 networks then. When people saw that with their own eyes on network television, you only had 3 of them, and they're running that. It was very much like, and I have to link these things together, it's very much like what happened with the Vietnam War. Yeah. Until that war came in our living rooms, and we saw soldiers, American troops, being killed in a combat zone, which we'd never seen before, it's almost in real time. That created an anti-war movement. I maintain, if you did not have television going out in the battlefield, that war would have been like every other war. We would have rallied to the cause. We would have said we have to beat communism, but because there was, in fact, people seeing it, eyewitness it. That changed the dynamics. And that, to me, is what's changing the dynamics, too. Part of what's changing. There are other factors, I think, that change.
Yeah.
That, to me, is probably the 2 most important ones.
But I say something on
yes, please.
Thomas. I think it is true that what Thomas said about Trump bringing things out in the open. But what hasn't come out in the open, people of color have been reticent to talk about the ideology of white supremacy.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it is the ideology of white supremacy which is written into the foundational document of this country, and which is practiced not just in this country. We have been reluctant, and so we end up fighting the institutional expressions of white supremacy, but never dealing with the ideology of it. And I think now there is a greater willingness by everybody, but especially by people of color, to point the finger at the ideology of white supremacy and to insist that we have to not only address the institutions that manifest this ideology, but we have to address the ideology itself. And to do that means that we have to engage in very uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
You know, we've never had truth and reconciliation in this country.
No.
And that's key. Because you've had, 400, let's say 400 years, essentially, of people of color, particularly blacks, coming from slavery, going through Jim Crow, which is another form of slavery, to this point we are in time now. And there's never been any kind of reckoning on that. We do it piecemeal. We have never had a government-sponsored or basically government-sponsored reconciliation of that. And other countries have done it. Countries that have gotten past a lot of this stuff have done it. That's one of the first things when you talk about forgiveness. You can't ask me to forgive you unless you acknowledge that there was something wrong in the first place. And that has not happened in this country.
You sound like a religious
We didn't teach about slavery.
Yeah, but let's take this break, because as often I've heard people say, when are you guys going to get over slavery? So when we come back, when we come back, I want to talk about 2 things: monuments and law enforcement. And then we're going to go to our last segment, which is going to be talking about, like, okay, we're here, 2020, how do we go forward? So let's take our this break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Thomas Fields and Dr. Carmichael Peters. Welcome back to PalacioMagazine.com with Thomas Fields and Dr. Carmichael Peters. Reconciliation. I just have to make one comment on that. I just, the idea of, reparations, the idea of reconciliation, goes in keeping with my my pessimism and maybe more my realism. I just don't see that happening in this country as it's presently configured. Maybe in the future, after I'm long gone, with this generation or even the Z generation or whatever comes after Z, we've got how many, 325 or 350 years of history behind us we just don't want to let go. Anyway, monuments and law enforcement. And I put them together because I see one as a symbol and the other one as a reality. And I worry that there's too much getting hung up on the symbolism. And even with law enforcement, and I said to you, Thomas, and I think I said this to Dr. Peters, that, it's not just law enforcement. There's a whole ecology of like the whole justice system that goes from arrest to parole, probation, to recidivism back into the system. And I just sometimes think that we think that the police are the problem when they're just a symbol of the state and the state using the police, often because they're giving political donations to their elected officials who then turn a blind eye to what the police are doing. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Monuments and symbols and law enforcement. Who wants to start first?
I think it would be interesting to study the etymology of the connection between, you call them monuments, I like to call them statues.
Statues.
And statutes.
Statues and statues.
Okay.
And so these monuments, they're held up as aspirational figures and therefore as statutes. Mm-hmm. I think we would be shocked if in Germany they had statues of Hitler all over the place. Because mm-hmm. it's a promotion. Mm-hmm. It's a promotion. And so it's not empty. These statues that are up and people are, the resistance to taking them down tells you the value, the cultural cachet that they have.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And yeah.
No, that's.
Well, those are statues, if you're talking about the Confederates, those are statues to traitors. They took a vow against this Constitution of this country. To have them paraded as being heroes goes against what this country is for. I mean, and a war was fought to stop that, to stop the Confederacy. A lot of people died in fighting the Confederacy. And to have monuments up to traitors, to me, and name military bases on top of it, goes in the face of what we are as people. And I'm glad to see that a number of people in the military generals, are saying, yes, these were traitors. So to have that argument, to me, lacks any kind of credibility.
But it's going beyond just the Confederate statues.
No.
I mean, there's a real conversation that I've said for years needs to be done about the fact that I think it was 13 or 16 of the signers of the Constitution. Well, how many of our presidents were slave owners at some point?
But if I could say something, we don't put up their statues because they were defending slavery.
Right. Yeah.
We don't do that.
Precisely.
Right.
And they were not, and they're not known for fighting to defend the institution of slavery.
Yeah.
That's not.
That's a
And so
different
if we don't make a distinction between Jefferson or Jefferson, if we don't make a distinction between Jefferson and Jackson, there's something wrong with our historical memory.
Right. Right.
And I think one of the problems that we are maybe getting into is that a lot of some young people are not making that distinction. And I think it's a very important distinction to make. Those who fought against the Union, those who fought for the Union, those who fought explicitly for the institution of slavery, and those who are held up because supposedly they didn't tell a lie about a cherry tree.
Let me just say quickly, add one thing on to what you're saying, Carmichael, and I completely agree. You have individuals, the founding fathers, some of them, not all of them, but some of them who did hold to the belief, even though it was a contradictory belief, that all men were created equal. I mean, that was the first time in history that it was documented. On a document for a country to put down all men were created equal. That has, I mean, as Martin Luther King talked about, that was a check that was written. It might have had, it was supposedly insufficient funds, but that's a check, and that's what we've been able to hold this country to. The fact that the founding fathers wrote that down. You know, the Bill of Rights, wrote down the Constitution, it guaranteed our freedom. Now, we all know that in reality, we were 3/5. When I say we, I'm speaking of Black folks, I'm speaking of slave people, 3/5. And that was done for the South. That was done for the slaveholders.
It was a political decision.
Yeah, there was some other stuff in there that was originally supposed to go into the Constitution that was taken out for the slaveholders. See, because of that, the Electoral College is one of those as well.
Right.
But my point is this. I cut the founders, the slaveholder founders that wrote that document a little bit of slack, because they did put forth a principle by which the country can at least aspire to. The slaveholders that rebelled against this country to keep slavery a reality, keep slavery the law, they were traitors. And to look at them as anything but, to me, goes against the values of what this country stood.
I'm going to be just because, you know, I love American history. Not even realizing how much I loved it. In all these years I've been studying it. You know, I'm just not a believer that I think it's an oversimplification to say that the founding fathers were not, yes, they wrote these beautiful words, but they were just talking about white people. And not only just white people, they were also talking about landowners. They were talking about a class of people, even though they kept saying that, no, we don't want to be like the monarchy. We don't want to be like England. We don't want, you know, the people who could first vote had to be landowners.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it was a selfish document that was created to, you know, protect themselves, to enrich themselves on a foreign soil that didn't belong to them in the first goddamn place. And then, you know, the rest is history in terms of manifest destiny, in terms of genocide, blah, 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 blah. So
I would agree with you, but.
Okay.
But it is true that they were flawed. There's no question about that. But like all of us, we are products of our socialization. And we are often blind to we take how we are to be normal. We are blind to the limits, to the ways in which our socialization chain our minds. For example, I think it is hard for us in this conversation to talk about speciesism. We don't think that beings, animals, that non-human animals,
Yes.
we are human animals, we don't think that non-human animals have rights. 100 years from now, they'll look back at this podcast and they'd say, look at them brothers talking about humans. You know, they were self-interested. They were just pushing their own species. And they would be right.
They would be absolutely correct.
They would be right. And so I don't want to, a little side thing. I was talking to this dude, and he was telling me, you know, his parents, they abused him. They, you know, but what he was doing was anachronistic. He was taking the standards of now, and he was looking back at his parents about 60 years ago, and he called the belt. He did what they did back then, common, everybody was doing it. Hell, you had to go and cut the switch that they'd beat you with. He said, you know, and so he was visiting back on them standards that are current. I argued with him that if we were principled in that, he and I would be paralyzed, because we wouldn't know in 50 years. They'd look back at what we think is normal and they would find moral outrage. And so, on the one hand, I agree, those dudes were flawed, as are we. And I am as blind to my prejudices. That's the power of a prejudice. We don't see what guides us from behind. I didn't see that black is beautiful or big is beautiful because I'm wearing these lenses that I've been socialized with, and things look pretty damn good. But somebody smudged the lens. They say black is beautiful, big is beautiful, and suddenly it obscured my view, and I had to begin examining the lens through which I was making sense of my world. That's the slack I'm cutting them founding. But one more thing. I think Ronald Reagan was right on when he said that that the Contras in El Salvador were the moral equivalent of the founding fathers of this country.
Oh, yeah.
I couldn't agree with him more. Yeah. That the people he was arming, because the founding fathers of this country were slave owners. Mm-hmm. It was sexist. I mean, it's not just all men. We took it seriously. Hell, we didn't think women were worth a damn.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But anyway.
No, I know. I see that. But my point I'm trying to make is, you're right. We can't put ourselves physically in that time. What I just really believe is that we need to demystify.
I agree.
Yeah, sure.
And I think I think this idea of American exceptionalism, that we have been blessed by whatever.
Can we curse on your show?
Well, you can do whatever you want.
American exceptionalism is bullshit.
Yeah, well,
yeah. It's also gotten us in trouble. It's gotten us in serious trouble. And we're still paying the dividends for American exceptionalism.
There is not one president, including Obama, who wants a political future who cannot subscribe to American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
Not one.
It's a tenet of our country. I mean, we all believe, even us here at this table, I'm sure, some point in our life believe in American exceptionalism. And that is what you're taught in school, that you are American, regardless if you're taught in a shack, a tar roof shack. You're taught you're an American, and therefore you are somehow, just to be on the soil.
Yeah,
blessed with being an American. And
hold on a second. I just got this message that flashed up on the screen that I hope is correct. It says that they've removed the 40-minute limit. Oh, you saw that?
Yeah, unlimited.
God, I hope that didn't get recorded.
I did see it though.
Let's take. Thomas, you're right.
Let's take up.
You're right, Thomas, about that exceptionalism thing. We're not in a one of them shit countries.
Yeah.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we sort of didn't deal with the law enforcement thing.
Yes.
So let's do this. Let's come back, talk about law enforcement, and then I really want to focus more on, again, this contrast between, if any contrast, between 2020 and 1968. And does it even matter? Because, I'm only bringing it up because I keep hearing people says, when I was in 1968, and,
you know the old joke about 1968, right?
What?
You know the old joke about 1968?
What's the joke?
If you remember it, you weren't there.
Yeah, well, trust me, I remember it because I was there. All right, let's take our break, and then we'll return in a moment. Welcome back to PalaccioMagazine.com and our conversation with Dr. Carmichael Peters and Thomas Fields. One of the issues that I brought up in the last segment was law enforcement. And here's where you can look at 1968 and remember law enforcement in Chicago, but it was the same thing in every street. I mean, I grew up in New York City. The police in New York City were known for being one of the most corrupt police forces in America and one of the most violent. And so when I see pictures now of demonstrations in New York City and the police going crazy, I have to sit back and kind of like, oh, I'm having a flashback to 1968. When I was arrested, in 1968, it was because we were at a demonstration trying to reopen a school during the teacher's strike. And I remember there was a police officer who had an axe handle instead of a baton. And I remember one of the people with us, young black brother who started taking pictures, and they just pounced on him and beat him. Other people jumped in. I jumped in to save somebody else. And when they grabbed me, I mean, this guy was choking me to the point where I almost passed out. And he broke my glasses. And this was literally mothers and children at a demonstration. With the exception of a couple of us who were guys, everybody else was, mothers and children. They didn't care one bit. And when they got us to the police station, we knew that they were taking care of the first guy. Well, first because he was black. Second, because he had the audacity to have remember how we used to wear bullets with the little bullet around our neck?
Yes, I do remember.
They had yanked it off and shoved it into his leg, because when they threw him back into the cage with us, he was bleeding. We kept saying, you got to call the doctor. I mean, the hospital, 911, whatever it was back then. And they eventually came and got him, but they really did a job on him. This was all over a demonstration to open up a school.
Antonio, I would just say this. You talk about being optimistic. The one area which I am not optimistic happens to be police. And I will tell you that nothing has changed. I think a lot of things have changed, but nothing has changed as it relates to our judicial criminal system. Perhaps it's even gotten worse. And it's been exposed. You have such examples as in Chicago, you had over 200 black people primarily, who were tortured and the word is used deliberately, tortured. It came out in a government investigation. They were tortured by certain members of the Chicago Police Department and organized members. This has been going on even during slavery, when a lot of Southern police departments essentially were an outgrowth from slave patrols. That is reality, that's fact. So I don't see anything has changed. You cannot reform police departments because unions are too strong. That is not going to happen. And everywhere it's been attempted, it has failed. I believe the only way you're going to get some change in our police system is whole scale. I mean, one, you're going to have to essentially disband the police as they did in Camden, New Jersey, and start over again, if that is possible. And I say that if that's possible because you've got unions who want to fight that tooth and nail. You've got politicians who are beholden to unions because they contribute money to them. But it starts also before that. And this is the one thing I just want to really bring out in the open. It starts in schools. Those schools in most Black and Latino communities are intentionally bad because what has happened in this country is we want those people to fail because we don't want them to be competition. It is no accident that the vast majority of police departments and fire departments are people who are white, who don't live anywhere near those communities. That's not an accident. And primarily, again, much of that is about controlling those communities. And it's the police departments in this country are, by and large, there are some exceptions within those departments, but by and large, those departments are for occupation. And however you define occupation, if you look up occupation, what it means in the dictionary, you can put that definition towards the vast majority of police departments in this country.
If I could add to what Thomas said, unions, the power of police unions and the hold that they have upon politicians. But there is a culture in the police force that people who are brought into the police force, they are socialized in a culture of non-accountability, and they are defended in that by the courts. The courts, the system, the legal system where people are held accountable do not hold police accountable the way that other citizens are held accountable. And so therefore there is a sense in the culture of policing that they are above the law. The only societies that would make sense in is authoritarian ones, not democracies. And so Thomas's talk about school districts, I could, as director of the honors program at Chapman University, I could tell the zip codes that applicants to the honors program would come from. The funding of those schools with property taxes, and therefore the underfunding of those schools, there is no such thing as equal opportunity. And therefore, we do not provide equal opportunity, and the society holds those children accountable for equal results. No equal opportunity, but we hold them accountable for equal results. And what we have consequently is a pipeline from schools to juvenile halls to prisons. And slavery may have ended in a certain form, but the 13th Amendment reinscribed slavery.
Right.
And the present system of imprisonment is a form of slavery. People do a lot of labor in there for no pay.
Yeah.
And so the courts, the culture, the unions, and the politicians, I don't see the police changing. They are arrogant, and every one of us I don't know anybody who doesn't think that they act as if they're above the law.
Mhm.
They do. And
I have to say though that, you know, I don't want to say that I'm for a revolution in the traditional sense of the word, the way that unfortunately we used to throw around the word in 1968. But I will tell you that where my pessimism comes is that the police are an instrument of the state. Citizens vote with both their dollars, their contributions to elected officials, and with the ballot to people who say that they're going to protect them from, those people. And we all know what that is. And, listen, as someone who grew up in the projects in the South Bronx, my mother and father wanted to be protected also, from criminals. And although my father always seemed to think that only criminals were, of a certain color. And I say that with all due respect to my father. We've had this, he's passed, but we did have this discussion. And I just feel like those of us who want to see some kind of radical change in the way this country exists can't help but keep going and looking at people who, again, cast their ballot and their money to candidates who promise them they're going to be safe. And what everybody knows what that means. And I just, Long Beach is a wonderful example of a recent article that talked about how many donations were given to the elected officials. And number one was Al Austin, who is a union organizer. And the mayor didn't get as many donations as others, but he uses the fire and police when he wants to get, some proposition on the ballot, which usually revolves around some kind of taxes. So because, the promise is we're going to give you more salaries, we're going to give you better equipment, we're going to give you, better firehouses. I just think that this is going to be a real hard nut to crack because, again, as I said earlier, the police are just part of a long chain of law enforcement and the courts.
But they play on our fear.
And they play on our fear. And they play on our fear.
And we fall in line. But if I could, just one quick thing. You speak as though we live in a democracy.
Oh, damn, there I go again.
No, but one of the things that we have to do, it's like the ideology of white supremacy. It needs to be out in the open. We need to lance that boil. We need to talk about it. We live in an oligarchy, not a democracy. But I think Desmond Tutu, when he was talking about apartheid, he said, it's not, apartheid can't be reformed. It's not a matter of making the chains more comfortable. I have and go to bed easy and feel safe because we think that every 2 years pulling a lever or doing something, we are free. But who is it that we vote for? It's the wealthy and the well-connected who give us these candidates. And we don't have a participatory democracy, we have a representative democracy. And we think that they represent us. But when we look at their legislation, when we look at what they do, we know who they represent, but we live with the illusion that they represent us. And so if there's going to be change, we've got to address the issue that Rhino Niebuhr, North American thinker, put it nicely, that private property ought to cease to be private property when it ceases to be private. In other words, when private property translates into social power, it is no longer private property. And who is it that have power and pull the levers in this quote unquote democracy? It's those with wealth and therefore with social power.
Right.
And so, hell, I mean, we, who is it that the occupying force, the police force, what is the order that they are maintaining? And is it in the interest of people? Well, when we look at the transfer of wealth, when we look at the 99%, I mean, come on. I don't know how people have not been more restless given the economic inequalities that people are suffering in this country.
Yes.
It's not a democracy, and we ought to talk about it.
I think we have the mechanism of change in our hands. And a lot of it depends on organization. Part of this goes into what you're saying, is this income inequality is going to be huge. It's getting worse and worse. And I think what has kept this thing going in large part has been what's kept it going forever, particularly in the South. If you can get poor whites to believe they somehow or another are in an elevated status, and you're doing things in their interest when in fact you're not, but because they can look and say, I'm better than that black over there. No matter what happens, I'm better than. As long as that, and that gets back to white supremacy, but as long as they can say that and feel that and believe it, they will vote against their interests. They've done it time after time again.
Yeah, they've done it all.
Yeah.
However, what I do think we may see is as this income inequality continues, we may see people start to realize, and particularly with the pandemic, particularly with Donald Trump and his failed economic programs, and they have failed, and they're going to fail even worse, that we may see people come to some understanding that their best interest is not in the oligarchy, it's not in those people in power. If they ever do that, and there has in fact been times in this country where that has happened for periods of time, where the underclass has decided that their alliance or allegiance is not with the ruling class. That happens on occasion. They're getting beat down, but that happens. But maybe if it happens again, maybe this time people will be a little smarter, and maybe the organization will be there.
Let's take our last break, and we come back. Let's talk about, what the hell are we going to do? What should we be prepared to do? And does any of this matter?
Yes.
All right, let's take our break. Return with PalaciaMagazine.com. Welcome back to PalaciaMagazine.com. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Carmichael Peters and Thomas Fields. My name is Antonio Ruiz. So 2020, we still have a pandemic. Donald Trump is still president. There are many who think that Joe Biden is not going to radically change things even if he wins. And the nightmare scenario is, what if Trump wins? What if he loses? What are his supporters going to do? And are we headed for a civil war? So it's nice that we've compared 1968 to 2020. I'm worried about 2021 now. And does any of this conversation really matter in the sense that, because if you look at where the scenarios are going, I mean, it really is going to come down to either Trump is going to win or he's going to lose. If he loses, what happens? And if Joe Biden is inaugurated, is anything really going to change? And are we still, first of all, and we may still be, and we probably will be, in the middle of a pandemic anyway. So that colors everything. Your thoughts? Doctor, you want to go first?
If if Joe Biden wins, the subversion of the courts that is currently going on in this administration, with the appointment of very young and reactionary and in many times unqualified people to life appointments in the federal court, this administration will have a generational effect because of what they did, because of what McConnell did by blocking Obama's appointments and railroading through Trump's appointments. That is one thing that will not continue. One thing. If Biden is elected, this pandemic continuing, he will not seek, as this current administration is currently doing before the Supreme Court, arguing against the Affordable Care Act. What Thomas said earlier about poor whites looking at their skin color as an advantage and not seeing common cause with others. There are huge numbers of Trump supporters who benefit from the Affordable Care Act, and they are supporting him. They did it with it is, and I think Thomas touched on it. It is this issue of race that has allowed a certain group of people to consistently vote against their own self-interest. With Biden, you know, he will win if he remains in the basement and is silent. With Biden, at least perhaps, as critical as I am of this society and its institutions, there has been a degrading of those institutions under this current administration. That degrading will not continue, at least that much. And therefore, there might be some reforms, or at least stopping something such as the United States will become a member again of the WHO, which is essential in pandemics. The United States will once again join the Paris Accord, which is essential for the future of the many species, not just the human one. And so, will Biden do great structural changes? No, he won't.
Yeah.
But he will not degrade the institutions to the extent that they are currently being degraded.
Thomas?
Yeah, good segue for institutions, because I think the only thing that saved us has been the institution of the military. And, it's funny because in many other banana republics, and that's kind of what we have been marching down that lane, the El Presidente, first thing he does, gets the military, gets the Secret Service, gets the intelligence, get them on his side. Fortunately, our El Presidente was too stupid to do that. He alienated the intelligence community. He alienated the military, although he claimed they were his generals. And I found it very comforting that when Trump started talking about he was not just the commander-in-chief, he was in fact the Godhead, that the military basically said no. And I'm clear on one thing, that when the Biden in fact did go to the military and brought up this thing about what happens if he decides he's not going to leave, if he loses. And I know I would bet a lot of money that the military says it's not going to happen. We will escort him out. Because Biden made a couple comments. He raised that question, and then a couple of days later, he made another comment. And he was confident. So to me, this gets back against this whole thing, the sinner that doesn't hold, or the sinner that does hold. The military, I feel, the military to me, in many ways, redeemed itself, at least in that particular instance, particularly when it came down to Lafayette Park.
Right.
The chief of staff, the Secretary of Defense backpedaled big time because generals called them on it. And it's very clear there is civilian control that civilian control upholds the Constitution. So I feel very confident about that. As it relates to 2020 and Biden becoming president, I don't think a revolutionary radical could win, frankly, in 2020 against Trump, because he would have used that. He would beat them over the head with socialism, and you've got a crew of people who would be scared. Biden is for what he is at least Biden is the order they understand. And again, the other thing about the judges, I'm more horrified about the judges than anything else. But one thing that does give me comfort, and I'm sure this is going to happen, you don't need a constitutional amendment to declare more judges. You can name more judges. Congress can pass a law that says that we can increase the number of judges on federal benches. We can increase the number of judges on the Supreme Court. There's nothing sacrosanct about 9 Supreme Court justices.
Right. That
can happen, and I would be willing to bet a lot of money, my mortgage for one, that it will happen.
Didn't FDR do that?
What's that?
Right.
Didn't FDR do that?
No, he
tried to stack it. He did not try and change it.
Yeah.
But you can, in fact, and if the Democrats win both houses plus the White House, I feel very confident that they will, in fact, expand the judicial to do that. Because what McConnell and Trump did was maybe not illegal, but it sure as hell was immoral as hell. Yeah. And it goes against the values of the country. So that's my take on that.
Okay, so we've solved the problems of the United States of America. I want to thank you all for taking the time to...
Why am I laughing here?
I don't know.
Because the man is in creative writing and he has learned the power of irony.
That's right.
I want to thank you all for taking the time to speak. I really want to continue this conversation in a few months as we get closer to the election and as things get a little more clear. Because one of the things that I'm dying to hear on August 1st is who's going to be the vice presidential candidate. I think that, my wife's starting to think that it is not going to be a Black woman, that in fact, it's either going to be, well, I won't speculate here because speculation won't do any good.
I would argue that the man in South Carolina who gave Biden the Democratic nomination will have a lot to say about who's.
Thank you. Clyburn will. You are absolutely correct.
I hope so. I hope you're right.
Clyburn's going to be the.
Biden owes him.
Yes.
He owes him.
Hey, can I make one suggestion?
Yeah, because a white politician's never gone back on his word.
Can I make one suggestion?
What?
You said we need to do this again in the future. I would certainly like to put down the date on our calendars of November, maybe like 6th or 7th.
Oh, that's too close.
When we come back.
No, I want to do it. I want to do it after we've heard from who the vice presidential nominee is, because that's going to be that will affect everything moving forward. Anyway, thank you, Thomas Fields. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Daly.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
We will talk soon.
Okay.
Thank you.